and I checked my email. I was reminded there was something that said they were going to have some disruptions starting at noon today. So I'm not in a good location apparently, but we'll do it here on the phone. Well, thank you guys for being here. I'm going to have to juggle some things here. Penny, will you go ahead and just call roll this time? Do you have
I will. Give me 1 minute, and
I've got it. I'll call it.
Okay.
Here we go. Angela.
Actually, it's ringing. I am here.
Okay. Katrine Stevens.
Here.
Dell Phillips. All right. Charlie Baum. Scott Becker. Annette Tudor.
Here.
Annette. Vanessa Presson. Bill Spurlock. Jason Golden. John Atkin.
Here.
Paul Rose. Robert Eby.
Here.
Okay. All right. Well, thanks everybody for being here. We are going to do our usual. Because I'm doing this on my phone, I'm going to have to do it a slightly different way. And let me find my PowerPoint here. All right, we're going. Hey, let's see, guys, I'm so sorry.
We can see it, Doctor.
I know. I'm trying to look at it on my phone.
Okay.
All right, here we go. We'll go through the statement. Tennessee DOE is excited to work with us on this opportunity. Conversations aren't intended to reflect on the current BEP funding. Public submitted comments in writing. The comments encourage to focus on developing a new formula rather than revising the current one. We're going to review public comment, make recommendations for what should be included. And everybody should feel free to communicate openly. Documents and records are subject to public inspection, and all recommendations submitted by the committee and subcommittee will be reviewed and considered, but not all recommendations will ultimately be included in the proposed new funding formula. All right, so we are going to move on through the agenda. What I do want to note from conversation with Penny, who's involved with a number of these committees, I think we again get the Gold Star Award, although I'm not getting it for technology today. We got the Gold Star Award, and that we're apparently pretty far ahead of some of the other committees, and that we did go through and we did prioritize the things that we wanted in the formula. So what we're going to be doing today is reviewing public comment. I know we haven't had it all that long on the draft framework, and then and some steering committee feedback, and basically see if there's anything about what we submitted before that we want to update. What I'd like to do, though, before we do that, is the big news that has occurred since our last meeting was the draft framework has been shared out, and obviously the public has been invited to offer feedback on that. Do any of you have feedback on what you've seen from the draft of the spending formula that's been shared at this point?
I'll comment a little bit. This is Annette.
Yeah.
I've reviewed it, and I think it's a great step in the right direction. I think my concerns or questions at this point are about more specificity and representing, looking at things that are not explicitly stated. Like, it doesn't mention a lot of things. So are a lot of things not going to be there specifically, or will we get more specificity later? And like, I think at one point we talked about, or maybe that was in a SCORE conversation, we've talked about a crosswalk between BEP and this new funding model. So when I did that compared to my district, there are a lot of things not represented. And I also feel like when I pulled up our last month's priorities that we as a committee talked about, there are a lot of things we talked about that are not represented. And that's not to say maybe they won't show up somewhere. I'm just wondering where and when do we see those kinds of specific things? And I don't know if that's the point of today, is to make sure that we revisit some of those things and make sure that there's some specificity, but then also talking through, I know we weren't supposed to talk about BEP, but when you look at the new funding formula, it's not enough just to say teacher salaries are going to be there without talking about, are we increasing those, or are we changing ratios, or same with counselors or nurses and all those things that keep coming up. Are we changing the ratios, or what is included in the base? Does that make sense? So I think there are good things there on the high level.
Yeah, I think I would tag on to that, Annette. I agree with what you're saying. When I sent my feedback to the draft to Commissioner Schwinn and the TN EDU email, I really focused a lot on the base element, because my understanding is we want the base to be at its largest. This is what all students have access to. So I noted that, I didn't see school buildings, whether that's upkeep, renovation, utility costs, maintenance personnel, et cetera, that should be incorporated in the base and clearly delineated. I did not see instructional supplies and materials. All students, all grades, all content should have access, and that should be clearly noted in the base. I did not notice anything about CTE equipment. Now, I noticed there was a piece of CTE in direct funding, but I'm talking about all students have access to equipment, machinery, personnel, course materials, etc. And then I noted specific personnel. I saw nurses lifted up. Well, I made a comment. What about a superintendent for every district being called out like the nurses? What about, and I saw in there the local decision making related to principals or assistant principals and all that jazz. But I put a CTE director, at least one per district. So I did put some things there. And then I also noted the student teacher ratio K2. I really believe we're talking about all students having access to this thing. And that is a small class size, so I can capitalize on sound instruction where literacy and numeracy is at a high level, so that when I progress forward, the foundation is there, it's rich, and we're thinking about retention law, we're thinking about all those things that are out there. Well, then ensure that it's in the base. Related to outcomes, direct funding, I just kind of wanted to focus my attention on base. The one notation I made about direct funding is I think it would be pertinent for the state to pay for at least 2 ACT assessments per student.
Great, very specific and rich feedback. I'm glad you have passed that on already.
Ted, I'd share a couple of concerns, I think, with the framework. Obviously, one of them that I'm going to share with y'all. I couldn't remember where we landed in our subcommittee recommendation on where we put charter schools. I could go back and look, I'm sure, but help me. But I think in conversation since the framework came out, I have some misgivings about charter school being both in the base and an added weight. I don't, when we talk about specific numbers, if you get $7,500 a kid, for throwing out a number, if a kid's in a public school, if a kid's in a public charter school, that $7,500 is the same amount. And if they're ELL at either place, or special needs, or any of the weights that follow, I just don't think they need the $7,500 and an additional weight because they are sitting in a charter school. And I know the argument on the other side is as I look is to help pay for capital needs. But I couldn't remember where we landed, but I have some negative feelings about that piece of it coming out of our, I guess, committee. And the second piece of mine, I think we all need to, the local match has not been discussed a lot in that framework, if at all. I mean, we had meetings about it regionally, but I think before it gets to a final figure, there has to be some knowledge known to all districts about the model, whether they're going, it looks like they're trying to get to a system level fiscal capacity versus an average of the TASER and the CBER. And if it goes one way or the other, if it goes all district level fiscal capacity and ability to pay, then particular in the municipal school districts, it could have a real big negative financial impact. So my feedback moving forward is there have to be some answers with real numbers, and which formula are they going to use for that figure?
This is Jason Golden. I'd like to parallel that first of those two comments. What struck me as glaringly unlike anything else was the weight to charter schools. The explanation on page 3 was had no. It struck me as having no difference between the expenses at a public school and the expenses at a charter school, and is inconsistent with the way the student model has been described. I think the state DOE is going to have to put some more explanation into that. If what they're saying is on a student model, we need to give charters more funding for the capital expenses that everyone would have as well.
Great feedback. Anybody else on the call?
Dr. Horrell, I have pulled up the recommendation list from the committee from our last meeting, first week of January, and under base, there was a note, charter schools should not be included in the base. That's coming from your subcommittee.
Yes, and I think the extension of that was, I think the intention, and y'all can correct me if I'm wrong, was we shouldn't be, that it wouldn't be in the weight either. I was also struck by, I think the weight, for lack of a better term, that charter schools had in there. There are lots of things we talked about that might be weighted, and charter schools was what, their number 4 with a low level weight. That certainly, from the discussion we've had, that didn't reflect, I don't think, anybody's preference on this committee. So I do think that should be noted. I'm with John. I can't really conceptualize why, and Jason and really everybody, I can't see why a charter school student would require more per pupil funds than anybody else. We all have facilities needs. We all have upkeep and maintenance and new buildings and all these things that sometimes are brought up with the charter school argument. But that one seemed glaring in its, I guess, the disproportionality between, I think, the importance to us and where it seems to rank in the draft proposal.
I'll also echo the comment on fiscal capacity. I've gotten a lot of comments about that and needing more clarification on what that will be, and also maintenance of effort, how all that ties together. That's certainly there are differing opinions across the state, and whether you're talking to districts or you're talking to the municipalities, the commissions, et cetera. But I think people are looking for more clarification on what's the plan with regard to fiscal capacity and maintenance of effort.
It definitely seems like the elephant in the room in this conversation, and it's almost hard to contemplate the rest of it without knowing the answer to that. I was struck, I think, as Annette mentioned first, by the lack of specificity of the draft plan, and I also do understand that I believe they're looking for more feedback, but we still don't it's just hard to think about what that looks like without more specifics. I was also concerned that some of the areas we discussed, like gifted education, for example, it almost seems to be like those are things that would be negotiated on an ongoing basis, or it said based on the specific needs of local districts. That made me a little bit nervous about the draft plan too. Some of those things that were in the category of direct, I believe they were in direct payment, but made it sound like that would be something that would have to be almost figured out later, I guess.
Yeah, I think that ended up in unique learning needs as a weight.
Yes.
But it's
I'm
like
sorry.
EL, students with disabilities, 504, dyslexia, they're all lumped in there, like you say, sort of, well, you can do whatever you want based on whatever your needs are. But I would propose that those are separated and we suggest some weights, students with disabilities and maybe the range of a self-contained situation versus a resource student versus a fully included student, and what it costs to support those students compared to dyslexia, which is essentially now an unfunded mandate in some way. So there's a lot of resources that go to that versus 504. In some cases, 504 supports are pretty minimal depending on who the student is and what their needs are, and EL. So it's almost, I really think those should be specific with some recommendations for weighting those separately. I was worried about that one as well. Same with gifted.
Mm-hmm. And thank you for the correction. Yeah, those were, that's right. Unique learning needs weight. It seemed almost like a catch-all.
Yeah.
And if a kid falls into one of those categories, it seems like we ought to be able to say how that's weighted. I mean,
right. Yeah.
Take educate a kid like that. So are we on the same page that as part of our feedback, it should be that the unique learning needs category needs to be fleshed out with specific weights per category?
Yes.
Yeah, I agree. And then in addition to the things that Kat said, as well as Annette and Jason.
Yeah, I would agree with Katrine that we need to go back to the base too and make sure that we have an exhausted list of things that should be included in there. And then I think we need clarity on what the document says when it says prior to the base, it says all items funded in the current formula. Well, what does that mean? Just the category, or all items as they're presented in BEP according to those ratios? Or, all categories is one thing, but we still don't have enough of the things that are in BEP that should be funded in those categories. Does that make sense? Like enough assistant principals or enough counselors or enough nurses. So I think we need clarity on that, plus more included in the base.
And consistency, if we're lifting up specific roles, educator, nurse, counselor, then we should consistently list out whatever other roles are a part of the base that all students should have access to.
Correct. Yeah, I agree.
Yeah, there's probably some irony is that we're kind of asked not to discuss the BEP, but the draft formula seems to suggest that you have to have some familiarity with the BEP to understand what's included in the base. So, sounds like we're recommending that those things be laid out as well, not just additions to the BEP, but specific. I mean, it seems like you almost have to lay out all the positions or everything that's funded.
I agree. It's almost like listing the components of the BEP again.
Well, I would assume that for the legislators to be comfortable, if that's where this is headed, they would also need that laid out. What's being funded and what's not.
Am I right, Ted, that this goes once all the recommendations are compiled, that this goes to a legislative steering committee first before it comes to the full General Assembly?
Well, I think it goes to I think the state steering committee is not only legislative. I think that's I think that's who's making the final recommendations to the Department of Education. Penny, you can check me on this, and then the department would put together the final proposal, I guess, that would go to the legislators, or?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay. All right, so Penny, I know when we spoke, again, just correct me, but we were really charged with kind of prioritizing the things which we really got through at the last meeting. So we have the option of either reprioritizing, or we could go on to the policy sections, or we could continue to try to make sure that our feedback on the draft proposal is clear. Representative Baum, did you just join? Is that right? I think you're muted still.
Okay. I've been here. I've had a little trouble figuring out how to get this screen enlarged, but anyway, I've been here and I've heard everything you've said.
Well, are we, I don't want to jump the agenda. Is it fair to ask you as a legislator, feedback going, based on the draft, what as a legislator, what was your feedback in terms of how close this is to something that you think you and your colleagues are going to be comfortable voting on, particularly given the timeline ahead of us?
Well, the Department of Education representative showed me a draft last week, and I guess I felt like it was summarizing the comments from 18 different groups. It didn't really look that much like what we had talked about, but then I guess I had to recognize that 18 other groups have had some feedback, and I don't know what they've been discussing, and so maybe we're just 1/18th of the draft, and so maybe I shouldn't be surprised if it didn't strongly reflect what we've been discussing.
That's certainly fair. Yeah, you'd have to go back and watch all the 17 other committees and their other 5 meetings, I guess. None of us are able to do that, I don't think. Okay.
Yeah, and they showed me their draft. I mean, it was kind of a summary, and I'm not really sure to what extent they believe that characterizes what we've talked about. It seemed like it was a fairly brief summary, and I guess I wasn't really sure exactly what their summary was based on.
Gotcha. Well, and I think that reflects what I'm hearing is just kind of the consensus that there's obviously a lot of details that would need to be fleshed out before we could all comfortable even with what we're seeing, I guess. Does that seem fair? I'm going to ask the group, can we get a consensus on how to proceed? Do we want to spend our time here trying to make sure that Penny can relate our feedback on this, or do we want to move ahead to the policy recommendations, or do we need to understand more about what we're seeing before we talk about the specific policies?
Dr. Worrell, I can add to this week's recommendations the notes that I've taken from your discussion so far. I can share what I have so far, and I can just add that to your recommendations from last week. I'll just carry these over unless you all want to reprioritize these, but I can add these recommendations. And those that I've already captured, that charter schools not be included in weight as well as base. Unique learners need to be fleshed out. Needs to be more specificity in the base, and consistently list other roles listed in the base.
And Penny, did you say that you felt like from our meeting last week and the other meetings that you've seen, we're kind of caught up with the other committees, or working ahead on what?
Yes, you are. You all finalized your prioritization last week. and the other groups that I'm working with just finished their prioritization this week, and they'll move into the policy conversations next week, and you all are ready for the policy conversation.
I do have a question. In looking at our notes from the last meeting, and maybe it's in here and I didn't see it, and I know we talked about it at some point, but with us being in this particular group, growth and how we calculate growth, if that should be a part of the weight or the base or something. I know we talked about growth and how that affects our districts, and I just didn't know if that's included somewhere within our information. I didn't see it from last week's notes, but I could have overlooked it. So I'm sure there are many people on this call smarter than me, but I know we talked about growth and how that affects us.
And Representative Baum brought a piece of legislation to help address it as well. I think it got pushed to the end, if I recall, the other day, end of session. Penny, before I forget it, yes, we talked about growth, Angela.
Yeah.
But the fiscal capacity local match piece needs to be part of those recommendations. I'm not sure you captured it on that list, or I didn't hear it. I think that's huge. Just can't get past that piece until we know that and the numbers. So how's that going to be determined?
Okay, fiscal capacity local match should be addressed.
Yes.
I think one thing that would be important, we are just one committee out of 18, but we do feel like we're bringing some valuable information that we want to be sure that gets heard. So I think it would be helpful if somehow the steering committee can respond, it's probably to other committees too, of how they've heard what we've said to assure, in fact, they are hearing what we're saying and it's not just being lost in the, in the minutia or something like that. That makes sense?
Yes. Let's go. I want to go back to Angela's comment because she's 100% right. We did spend time talking about growth and where that should be. So let's be sure that I think, did we add that into, I think growth expenditures, we said construction costs due to expansion, growth expenditures, that may have been summarized in a way that maybe didn't capture the extent of the conversation. Because we know with growth, we did talk about construction costs and otherwise, but I think there's a number of other costs that can with growth, obviously.
Y'all, there is a reference in page 3 of that 4-page draft framework. It's in the direct funding section. And it reads, fast-growing, significant enrollment growth within the school community warrants same-year supports for the service provided as a result.
Okay, I think that's what I was remembering. I mean, we definitely talked about it, but yeah.
Yeah.
Thanks, Jason. I missed that. Thank you.
But it's also listed in our minutes from our last meeting, but we had it listed as a weight, a suggestion in the weight category.
Yes, I have it here. In addition to those common trends, construction costs due to expansion, in parentheses, growth expenditures.
Okay. Thank you.
Hey, Ted, I've been AWOL the last couple of weeks, last couple of meetings. Could you go back to the base on the charter? What was decided on that in terms of the funding?
On the draft or on our conversation?
On the draft.
Yes, the draft of their draft, they had 4 weights. The poverty and concentrated poverty was heavy. Rural was moderate. Unique learning needs, which was kind of this catch-all that we've been talking about that has lots and lots of things. The weight comparability says varies based on specific student needs. That's the kind of language that's throwing me off. I'm just not sure how do you deal with that. And then under charter schools, they said weight comparability light. This funding weight would ensure that when a charter school utilizes a school facility owned by the local school district and incurs all rent plus maintenance and improvement costs, additional funding will be available to support in-classroom services and resources for students.
Thank you.
You're welcome. The consensus of this group seems to be that that's not necessary. or shouldn't be prioritized in a funding formula. All right. This is great feedback. I want to check again. Do we want to, if we waited to have the policy conversation at next week's meeting, kind of in line with the other committees, we would remain on schedule. Do we want to do that and take advantage of being the Gold Star students that we are and working ahead, or do y'all want to work ahead on that for next week?
Can I ask a question related to that?
Sure.
So we've got the funding discussion and then policy. Are there any other sections after policy?
My understanding that's the theme of the last meeting.
Okay. So Penny shook her head. So
Yes, next week is the last meeting, and it is policy considerations.
all right. I've got to toss this out. One of the struggles I've had with analyzing my perception of the reasonableness of this is actual dollars. And so does anyone know when there's going to be a projection on that? And is all that going to happen after this committee structure has shut down?
Great question.
Yep, that's the question. I think that's the $1 trillion question here. I have not been given any insight into that as a subcommittee chair. I do know that SCORE put some things out that did have some dollars attached to it, but I don't know where those, and actually some specific percentages for weight, but it's not been indicated to me that those have any validity necessarily. And I think you're right that all the dollars and cents are going to be after this process is done. And I will share that I did ask this question, so it's on video, so I don't mind repeating it, of the subcommittee chair meeting. Part of, I guess, what I've had a hard time with is I feel like we've heard 3 messages that cannot all be true, I guess. And one is that no district would get less money than they're getting now. The second is that some districts would get more money to educate students in specific categories based on the weights. And then the third part, which I guess makes the other 2 impossible, and I realize it's just a general statement, but some of the messaging lately has been this is not about more money, this is about better allocation of education funding. Or it's not necessarily about more education funding, it's about how do we allocate education funding. If no one's getting less money and some districts are getting more money, there will have to be more money, clearly. But we have not, my understanding and the response to that was that I don't want to say that the legislators want it or who wants it, but that there needs to be some parameters of a formula. And then I was told once that was approved or agreed upon, then there would be a conversation about what it looks like to fund that. And that conversation may be a multi-year conversation. And it obviously includes the local match. There would be a kind of maybe 5-year hold harmless, I think is the number that was thrown out, where districts could count on the same amount of money at least. And then after 5 years, there'd be the effect of this new actual formula that would involve the local match. So it's certainly a lot of unknowns. I don't, that's a long way to say I don't have any more specific information. That's all I know.
Ted, let me ask this question about the base. Is there expectation of uniformity of what that would look like across the state of Tennessee, or would there would be some differentiation depending on numbers? Or it actually would have to be by student, but would it be uniformity there? Because I can see where the differentiation would occur, on the various weighting and direct costs and things of that nature. But is there a uniformity of what the base would look like? Of course, it would be predicated on, fiscal capacity, but it would also come out to be something that would be, like you said, either you would get the same or more?
Yeah, I think the idea of this approach is that there is a guaranteed amount of money that every single student in Tennessee kind of brings with them when they come to your school district or a specific school. Every kid, no matter what, socioeconomic, black, white, rich, poor, special needs or not, they are all bringing that same base, and that's kind of the concept. And then the weights are added on top of that.
So can I suggest we go there? Can we go back to the base and make sure that we have an exhausted list of all the things we think should be in the base? Because I don't feel like, and I think Katrine said that what they've represented in the draft is not an exhaustive list. And there are lots of things in the BEP that are not represented in that base. If they're going to fully fund everything that was already in BEP, that's not even listed. So I kind of just did notes all over the place to see where did things fall. And then I took our recommendations and said, do these fall somewhere? Are they represented somewhere? There are things that are not there. I mean, principals, assistant principals, director of schools, instructional materials, SROs, those things are not represented. So my recommendation would be that we push policy to next week and that we go back to the draft that's here and kind of add more recommendations or suggestions or ask questions about the detail that we feel like might be lacking.
Sure. I'd certainly support that. And I think if we started with the BEP how-to, you could almost just read down the left column, right? We're assuming if there's money generated currently, these things, that has to continue.
Yeah, I did that. I took out the BEP and I just wrote whether it was going to be base, direct, weight, and if it wasn't represented anywhere in the draft, I put a question mark next to it just to try to figure out some sort of correlation between where we currently are and where we think we might be heading. I don't know.
Well, but anything in the BEP, we're saying, well, I guess you would take them out. So I'm looking at it now. You've got teachers, you've got career technical. Those are, we're saying teachers would be in the base, but career technical would not be in the base, right?
Well, that would be a question. I
think they should be in the base because all students, think about your high school students. What is the number of students taking CTE courses? Well, it's a requirement to have some of those pathways or courses taken. So why wouldn't it be in the base?
Good point.
I think one of the reasons maybe if there's just a K-5 district out there, that's not touching on it at all. That's, we do think about so much of our work in grade bands, but Katrine, you're right that the per pupil expenditure for CCTE programs, we all know it's significantly more, right? Because the pupil teacher ratio is lower. There's additional expenses related to it.
My thinking is if let's just say hypothetically go to that K-5 or K-8 or any district that may not have CTE, well, when you line it out, it gets a 0. That may be too simple. I don't know.
Wouldn't it be in the weighted area? That's kind of like it is now in BEP. The indices for career and technical education is a little bit higher than a gen ed. Just being in a regular classroom. So the weight would that be where it would fall?
When I think of base, I think of all students having access to X, whatever X might be. And then the weights are unique situations that require more dollars for one reason or another, whether, it's a student with disability, it's a rural district, it's a whatever. That's my understanding. So I'm thinking it would be, my thinking would be base for CTE.
Well,
And then I'm sorry, and there'd be a lot of differentiation in that also with completers and non-completers. So I still think, I get what you're saying, and I get that the teacher-pupil ratio is different, but I'm not sure that falls under the base.
well, and they said the completers might be something that goes under out.
Yeah, it's an outcome.
There's an outcomes category. Oh, Dr. Schwinn has joined us. Hello. Saw her pop up.
I would think that if you're going to include it in the base, to Katrina and Jason's points, you might have really kind of 3 different base numbers rather than there being $8,000 per student or whatever across the state of Tennessee. Every student gets $8,000, $7,000, whatever the base amount might be. You might have an elementary amount that's a little bit less, or maybe it's the same but accounts for smaller class sizes in K2, and high school accounts for CTE, or some delineation within that base amount, or that they might be different. K5 draws some base amount that's a particular number, middle school gets a little bit more for some CTE, high school gets significantly more for CTE, or leave it out of that and put it in the weight category.
The draft framework includes it in direct funding with a per pupil amount for participants. And for what that's worth, my immediate thought is that strikes me as reasonable. Of course, the question is how much, and is it addressing the CCTE needs appropriately?
Well, and it does become a which came first, the chicken or the egg kind of thing, because you can't offer the program and have participants if you don't have the funds to hire a teacher and build up the program. So
that's right. The timing of it, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. And those of us who have those programs, we know the startups end up being more expensive relative to those that are ongoing, because you do commit to an additional expense to grow that student base.
I was starting to think that you would have different bases per grade level because you've got smaller class sizes just by state law or board rule now. But I can also see the point that one may be, balanced out by the other, that in CT and in high school, you can have bigger class sizes for the most part, but then you're also offering these additional programs and more exploratory courses or electives, or rather.
Yeah, you triggered a couple thoughts. One, our PTR for all our high schools is lower than our elementary for that very reason, to give more options in courses. Also, the state pupil teacher ratios that follow those grade bands. I hope everyone knows that if you make a significant change on either side of that, either eliminating it, in which case you could do any max, all the building designs across the state have classroom sizes structured for the number of students who can fit based on the longstanding state ratios. So you can't expand it greatly because of that. If you reduce it, we don't have enough teachers. Nobody does, because their teachers aren't out there. So any significant change in either direction is going to have no practical effect without some massive expenditure to address it statewide.
Mm-hmm. Great point.
I'd also add that CTE, you can have an average of up to 25, and there's a lot of your more advanced that you would have a lower teacher pupil ratio. You may have a 1:16 and be able to make that up in another area.
All right, so our mission here to go down the BEP and make sure we filled in all the blanks has gotten us stuck on teacher.
Hey, Ted, before you do anything different, Penny has submitted a question I think she wants us to look at. It's in the chat, and we certainly, I think, want to address it before we close out. I don't know if you'd seen that or not.
I had not. I had to switch, Dr. Schwinn, and get on my my cell phone, which is not working quite as well. I was going to see if you wanted to say anything. She said it on the chat, popping in to say hello and thank you for your work. Policy question that's come up about fast growing. Is the purpose of the funding to, one, support the 1-year needs of the district until the district is able to generate the funding the next year, or two, intended to focus on fast growing over time with that funding, intended to support infrastructure and long-term investments? I wanted to ask this group first, which I know we appreciate.
I've got a thought. I've got a thought.
You're one of the fastest growing there is. Go for it.
Well, for us, it's both, because we have to hire teachers on the fly when we have growth, and then of course over time, as we hit those points where our schools become too small, we have to do both. That doesn't answer actual numbers like I've been asking about, but that's been our experience.
Jason, can I follow up on that? Because I think that's what we're trying to do now is take your feedback, and as it comes, figure out what modeling might look like. Because right now, as you all know, we kind of, it's 2%, and then if we can fund at 1.75 and we go down the list that way. What we're trying to think through, is this a one or the other, like keep doing one and maybe add two? Is it splitting it? There are obviously cost implications there, and then how you might think about that, because one of the things is that we're trying to move to is if you have fast growing, so you get those, like, let's say 2% additional kids in the year that we start funding that growth, you will generate the ADM that year. So for new kids or growth, you will generate that. So the fast growing money could actually be used for infrastructure for those districts who have growth over time. That's one option. Or we split the funds, or we keep doing it as we've been doing, or something else. So just to give a sense of, we've got a lot of room here with the data requirements and collections. We can actually start funding your increases in ADM in the same year in a way we haven't been able to before.
Well, Bill and others, feel free to toss in. I'm going to give you my immediate.
I'm going to agree with Jason on that, because we do have not only those students, the growth, but we have the facility where we have to expand our facilities in order to address the growth over time. I think it's no secret that he and I both are averaging somewhere around, I know we are 1,000 kids a year, and we could look at that over time.
And that's the same with Clarksville as well. We're averaging that same amount of growth every single year. So I'm agreeing with Bill and Jason on that.
One thing that works for us, Dr. Schwinn, is the payment schedule within the course of the year, where it's weighted later on in the year. However the funding is structured with a per student, I don't know if you all are planning on having some kind of structure given those fractions out over the course of the year, like you're currently doing. That helps with growth, because we get that weight later on. I'm trying to remember the exact months. I think maybe is February the last month we get it. Am I right about that? Maybe March. For what that's worth, keep that schedule piece in mind.
That's super helpful. And I didn't want to disrupt or anything, but it is coming up, and it is a massive budget question, as you can imagine. And so I was like, they're meeting right now. I'm just going to pop on and check before I give my opinion. If anything comes to mind, I'm going to be working on this with Sam probably throughout the weekend. And so my sense was it's a both. It's not a one or the other, because if you're keeping the kids, to the points made earlier, they have to go to school somewhere. There must be a building and all the infrastructure. So that might be some other kind of consideration, and would certainly look to the senator and representative for their feedback. And I'll give y'all a shout a little bit later. So this is super helpful, and I very much appreciate you giving me the grace of interrupting what was I might listen in a little bit more, because it was fascinating and super important conversation. But it's nice to see y'all.
Good to see you. And Dr. Schwinn, I'll add one thing that I think sometimes is lost in the growth conversation, and the other superintendents can relate, is you get to a point usually where you're growing, and you've got all the kids in a school, and then you open the school, and even though you're still growing, you're still spreading pretty much the same amount of peanut butter for that first year or two over into another piece of bread that still has to have all the startup costs. So, I mean, you haven't increased the number of students that dramatically in 1 year, but you have changed your operating costs dramatically, like depending on the number of schools you have. So if you go from 5 schools to 6, you've got, nearly 20% more of your operating costs, but you don't have 20% more students. You've got, 2 to 3% more students. So those are also challenges for fast growing communities. I think the way to, we deal with it is get just as big as you possibly can, where you can't stress test that building anymore. So you're at least starting with something, but even splitting it in half, you wind up your economy of scale, efficiency lost.
Yeah, thank you. I was about to use that phrase. Keller ISD years ago was one of our sister school districts, and I think they had high schools that were 4,000 or 5,000 students, and it was cheaper, right, per student. But that's just not been the model here.
Yeah.
We're more like Frisco than we are like Plano, as an example.
I get that reference. So, and that's helpful. We've been thinking about that with teachers too. When you lose 3 kids or 5 kids, you still have to fund that full classroom. It goes the opposite way, where you might get 5 or 6 kids, but you actually have to staff a whole new teacher because it's too big for a waiver. So I think we're trying to model all of that to figure out what the right dollar amount is that would accommodate, because we have more fast growing areas as the state expands, as you can imagine. So that's that consideration is actually, that's really helpful.
Yeah, fixed costs are very important.
Yes, they are. Yeah, and can be very pricey. So that's what we're looking at. All right.
We're all glad to hear that fast growing is such a significant part of the conversation you're having. That was noted earlier, just making sure that wasn't. We know it was mentioned in the draft, but the specificity that you're discussing is helpful and reassuring. So
thank you.
Yeah.
All right. Thanks, y'all. I'm going to shut up now, but I appreciate you and hang in there. Thanks.
Thank you, Dr. Flynn. All right. Do we want to pick back up with Annette's suggestion at trying to go down and making sure that the base represents everything we need it to represent? Is that the best? We're at 12:54 now of our scheduled 1-hour meeting. What's the best way to do this? This obviously it could be a pretty time-consuming exercise, or maybe it's not. Or Annette, do you want to tell us what you had come up with and just kind of do some thumbs up or head nods here? Or?
Well, just to start with, based on what I think, what Penny must have in front, is that our last week's or 2 weeks ago?
Yes, it is. It was last week.
So I took that list of information and looked at the draft and kind of cross-referenced that. Nurses are represented, counselors are there, social workers, behavior specialists are not specifically noted. K2 class size, maintenance, instructional materials, SROs, directors, schools, principals, and assistant principals. We mentioned all those things, but those are not specifically mentioned in the base.
Okay.
So I just sort of cross-referenced and made a list of things that were different, and then found, same with the rest of the document, just kind of noted where the rest of our things fell, were they represented somewhere, even if it wasn't where we necessarily prioritized it.
Is this group comfortable? And Annette, would you be willing to just share those notes with Penny and have her include those in the feedback for this week?
Sure, I'd be happy to.
Okay. Is everybody okay with that, rather than take them one at a time? Okay. Thank you, Annette, for your prep work on that.
Mm-hmm. Sure.
Cute Kids, Penny, is that your group there?
No, I actually thought it was yours.
It's not mine.
Where it's coming from? No, I don't know.
All right. Somebody had 3.
He's claiming them.
Yeah.
That they are strangers to me.
Okay, interesting. Ghost in the machine, I guess. All right. Well, we know that the focus of next week's meeting would be on the specific policies that kind of impact this. Things like, how do you determine what is the concentration of poverty? How do you determine economically disadvantaged students? Some questions like that. Is there anything else that this group would like to discuss before we wrap up? Is everybody comfortable with what we've done today?
Yes.
I just figured out whose children those were. Those were the commissioner's children. Somehow she was sharing her screen, I believe.
Well, that's very cool. They looked like they were having a good time.
Yeah.
Somewhere.
Can you ask her if she'll share some numbers that they have for this framework while she's flashing stuff up there?
I've got Sarah, I think she's gone now. I don't see her on the call, but I do have that as a question that I will share with TN EDU. Every week we are able to ask questions. The other question that I have specifically from your group, how can we be sure that the steering committee is hearing what you as the group have recommended?
Right.
And so Annette, if you will just share those with me, if you'll email those to me, I will put that in the recommendations and send that to Dr. Horrell for him to approve before I send it in.
I will do that.
Any closing thoughts or comments for the good of the group?
I always appreciate the discussion, so thanks to everybody, hearing everybody's perspective.
It's very helpful.
Absolutely.
It is.
Thank you for noting that. It's a very collegial group. It's a meeting I look forward to, and not the opposite of that, which we also have, don't we, sometimes. All right. Well, I hope everybody has a great weekend, and thanks for your engagement and your feedback. And we will meet again next week, same time, if I remember correctly. Yep. Okay. Thank you all.
Bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.